Some movies don't fade away because they're bad. They fade away because they don't fit neatly into a box. The Legend of Billie Jean is one of those movies. On the surface, it looks like a standard 80s teen film. Scrappy kids, authority figures who don't listen, and a system stacked against them. But dig a little deeper, and this movie is doing something very different from most of its era. It's not about learning karate, it's not about winning a fight, it's about fairness, media, rebellion, and how legends get created, whether you want them to or not. So today on Nostalgic Couch Potato, we're taking a deep dive into the Legend of Billie Jean, the cast, the context, the culture, and why this overlooked 80s movie still matters, because sometimes fair is fair. The Legend of Billie Jean centers on Billie Jean Davy, a working-class teenage girl in a small Florida town where kids are expected to keep their heads down and adults are expected to know better, even when they clearly don't. Billie Jean is played by Helen Slater, who gives the character a quiet, unflashy confidence that makes her believable as both an ordinary teenager and eventually a symbol. This was still early in Slater's career, just before she'd go on to play Supergirl, and you can already see why she was cast. She looks like someone people would follow, even if she never asks them to. Living with her is her younger brother Binks, played by a very young Christian Slater, years before the leather jackets and sarcastic cool became his trademark. Here, he's all nervous energy and simmering frustration, which works perfectly because Binks isn't trying to be brave. He's just trying to survive being a kid in a world that keeps reminding him he has no power. The inciting incident is almost laughably small. Binks's prized motor scooter gets destroyed by a rich local creep with connections, and Billie Jean does the unthinkable. She asks for the money to fix it. Not revenge, not punishment, just fairness. And that's where the movie quietly reveals what it's really about. Because instead of getting help, Billie Jean gets dismissed. The adults circle the wagons, the system protects itself, and a simple request turns into a lesson in how authority actually works when you don't have money, influence, or the right last name. As the situation escalates, Billie Jean and Binks are joined by Lloyd Muldaur, played by Keith Gordon, whose calm, grounded performance keeps the movie from floating off into pure fantasy. Lloyd isn't a revolutionary, he's the guy who helps because it's the right thing to do. And Gordon plays him with the kind of sincerity that makes the stakes feel real. They're also joined by Ophelia, played by Martha Gemmon, who brings a punk rock unpredictability to the group. Ophelia isn't rebelling for fairness or justice, she's rebelling because she hates the rules, and that contrast matters. Not everyone in a movement is fighting for the same reason, and the movie's smart enough to show that. What begins as a local dispute snowballs into a full-blown media event. Reporters descend, headlines simplify the story, and Billie Jean, who never asked to be a leader, becomes a symbol of teenage rebellion. Her haircut becomes iconic, her words get repackaged, and her image is sold back to the public as something both inspiring and dangerous. All of this unfolds against the backdrop of an 80s America where kids were increasingly left to raise themselves. Media narratives mattered more than truth, and rebellion didn't always look like a fist fight. Sometimes it looked like a teenage girl refusing to say that's just the way it is. By the time the dust settles, the Legend of Billie Jean has transformed from a small story about a broken scooter into a modern folktale about fairness, media, and the cost of standing your ground. There's a certain kind of 80s movie that only exists because the decade itself existed. Not because it was realistic, not because it was subtle, but because the cultural moment demanded it. The Legend of Billie Jean is one of those movies, and it's weird because it has everything an 80s cult classic is supposed to have. A killer soundtrack, a stacked young cast, a teen rebellion narrative, a media panic subplot, and a message that basically screams adults have lost control of the narrative. And yet, it almost never comes up when people talk about essential 80s films. which is strange because this movie is doing something very different from the usual Karate Kid, Rocky but for teens formula. Because this time, the girl picks up the sword. Part 1. What kind of movie is this, really? On paper, The Legend of Billie Jean looks familiar. Low-income, Florida town, single-parent household, teen siblings barely holding it together, a sleazy authority figure abusing power, and a system that protects itself before it protects kids. Normally, in an 80s movie, this is where the boy trains. He learns karate, he punches the bully. Cue montage. But Billie Jean swerves because the injustice doesn't get solved through physical domination. It gets solved through symbolism, media, and myth-making, which, whether the movie fully understands it or not, makes it one of the most politically aware teen films of the decade. Part 2. The 1980s context you need to understand this movie. You can't talk about The Legend of Billie Jean without talking about the 80s. And no, not the neon version, the transitional version. By the early 1980s, divorce rates were up. Kids were home alone more often. Trust in institutions was declining, and traditional family structures were visibly cracking. Women entering the workforce wasn't new, but it was newly visible. And to be clear, this wasn't universal across race or class. Minority women had always worked. The stay-at-home mom fantasy was largely a middle-class white luxury. But culturally, the shift hit everyone at once. More workers, lower wages, more competition, and a generation of kids who were quietly raising themselves on TV, MTV, and movie screens. That's the environment Billie Jean comes out of. Not feminism as theory, but feminism as lived frustration. Part 3. Billie Jean as anti-Karate Kid. Helen Slater's Billie Jean isn't strong because she punches harder. She's strong because she refuses to submit to the narrative being forced onto her. When her brother's scooter is destroyed by a rich creep with connections and the system shrugs, it's not about the scooter, it's about who gets believed. And this is where the movie quietly becomes radical. Because Billie Jean doesn't ask for revenge, she asks for fairness. Just money to fix what was broken. And when that gets denied, she doesn't become violent, she becomes legend. Part 4. The media as the real antagonist. Here's where the movie gets smarter than people give it credit for. The villain isn't just the rich guy, it's not even the cops, it's the media feedback loop. The press doesn't care about truth, they care about spectacle. Billie Jean becomes a symbol whether she wants to or not. Her haircut, her stance, her slogans. It's a dry run for influencer culture decades before the word existed. And the movie understands something that most 80s films didn't. Once the media creates a narrative, you don't control it anymore. You can only surf it or drown. Let's talk about Invincible, an 80s rebellion culture. Because this song doesn't just play in the movie, it is the movie. Rock music in the 80s was rebellion, not against nothing, but against expectation. You were told, get in line, play your role, don't make waves. And Billie Jean says, no. The movie understands that rebellion doesn't have to be destructive to be threatening. Sometimes just refusing to comply is enough. So why don't we talk about this movie more? Because it doesn't fit cleanly into a box. It's not an action movie, not a romance, not a straight-up feminist manifesto, not a feel-good ending either. It's messy. And messy movies tend to age better than clean ones, but they sell worse on nostalgia lists. The Legend of Billie Jean isn't about winning. It's about being heard. It's about a moment when kids realized adults weren't always right, systems weren't always fair, and sometimes the only power you had was refusing to back down. And maybe that's why it still hits, because every generation eventually reaches that moment. And when they do, they tend to rediscover Billie Jean, because fair is fair. And that's The Legend of Billie Jean, a movie that didn't just want you to cheer, it wanted you to think. It's messy, it's emotional, and it doesn't fit neatly into a nostalgia box. which might be exactly why it still works. If you remember this movie, you already know. And if you don't, maybe now you get why it mattered. If you enjoyed this retrospective, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what's an 80s movie you think history forgot. This has been Nostalgic Couch Potato, where we dig through the couch cushions of pop culture and rediscover the stuff that shaped us. And remember,